Will she or won't she? Will Judge Xinis in Maryland continue to find the Trump administration in contempt, or is she going to fall for the ruse where they brought him back to stand on some phony manufactured indictment in Tennessee for human trafficking, so pathetic and so skimpy and skeletal of an indictment that the leading prosecutor quit over it? And the only thing that supports the indictment is a confidential informant that was twice convicted of felonies and 5 times deported. Do you think he had an incentive to lie against Abrego Garcia? Well, we break it all down for you and explain to you what's going to happen next in those 2 competing cases, only on Legal AF, the podcast. Here's a clip.
And that brings us to Abrego Garcia and the importance of due process, because regardless of what the outcome of this detention hearing in the Middle District of Tennessee federal court is, Popok, the importance of due process, I think, was demonstrated because the prosecutors, the Department of Justice, they had to show evidence, and their evidence was very, very flimsy about why they think that Abrego Garcia is a threat to society, so much so that he needs to be detained and he can't be even let out on bail. He just, has to be there forever. On the other hand, you saw Abrego Garcia have a lawyer represent him and provide their own cross-examination of the prosecutor's witnesses and provide witnesses in favor of Abrego such that the judge can balance and weigh the evidence and make a ruling. Because our system isn't just trust me, bro, or in the case of Trump, whatever Trump says, that becomes the answer, especially when we know that Donald Trump's lying the moment he opens up his mouth. It's almost always the opposite of what he says is what's actually, really happening. So just a reminder, everybody remembers Abrego was sent to El Salvador, kidnapped, disappeared to a concentration camp at CONTEMPT is what it was called in El Salvador. The Department of Justice lawyer who was then kind of fired and pushed out admitted it was a mistake because back in 2019, there was an order by an immigration judge when Trump was in office saying that Abrego Garcia could not be ever deported to El Salvador. That based on hearsay witnesses and a lot of evidence that wasn't high quality, but an immigration judge did say there's enough if you want to deport this guy, deport him to another country. The one thing you can't do is deport him to El Salvador. So what does the Trump administration do or the regime do in 2025? They deport him to El Salvador. The DOJ lawyer admits it was a mistake. The Trump administration fires that DOJ lawyer for admitting it was a mistake, and they push him out. And then the Trump regime says there's nothing we can do to bring him back. He's stuck in El Salvador forever. We're not bringing him back. The pressure builds. Abrego files a lawsuit against Donald Trump in federal court in Maryland. The Trump regime, DOJ, in the Maryland case seem to be moving closer to criminal contempt. Voila, the Trump regime caves. They bring Abrego Garcia back to the United States after claiming it was impossible to do that. But when they bring him back to the U.S., they indict him immediately on human trafficking charges. Human trafficking, human trafficking and conspiracy to commit human trafficking. And when you actually look at what they're charging him with, they're basically saying that he was like a mule who was used to drive laborers around to work in different locations for a larger enterprise that would put migrants to work. And so the claim was he was pulled over in Tennessee. That's why this case is in Tennessee, driving an SUV with 8 people who seemed to be migrants in the car. He was pulled over in a traffic stop, I think by like the Tennessee Highway Patrol, while he was driving. The Highway Patrol, the Tennessee police officers, they gave him a warning. They thought nothing of it in 2022. They stopped him. Maybe they were suspicious, but they had better things to do with their time than deal with this. Who knows? But they didn't think that there was human trafficking or that there was a danger or anything. They took a police report. They gave him a warning. He went on with his life, lived in Maryland with his family, an American wife, American kids. Every year he reported himself back to ICE, and he would let them know his status once a year. He'd let him know They didn't think that he was a threat then at all. They didn't deport him to a foreign country, although they could have at any point in time other than El Salvador. And then the Trump regime, as part of their cruel deportation exercises, sends him to the concentration camp in El Salvador, where currently there are still hundreds and hundreds of people who are sent there without due process, who shouldn't be there, and they're fighting also to return to the United States. So he's indicted in the Middle District of Texas and the Middle District of Tennessee. The head of the criminal division there, basically the number 2 person at that federal prosecutor's office in the Middle District of Tennessee, a guy named Ben Schrader, he immediately resigns. And I think we see why he resigned. I mean, we knew it was because this was a guy who was there during Obama, Trump first administration, Biden, and now Trump. Nonpartisan guy, well-respected, top lawyer who goes after criminals, not people like he's not here to do Trump's politicized bidding. So this guy left. And then literally the office couldn't find any prosecutor to do this detention hearing other than the United States attorney, the top prosecutor, who's the interim top prosecutor in that district, which is just so rare that you would actually have that the U.S. attorney actually argue in a detention hearing that never, ever happens. And the purpose of a detention hearing, and then I'll toss it over to you, Popok, about what happens, is to determine, can you let Abrego out, pending the proceedings? He has to show up to court. If ultimately he's convicted of the crimes, he goes to prison. But can he be out on certain conditions? And usually the kind of qualifications is like, if you're a threat to society or a flight risk or things like that, you could be detained during your proceeding. But ultimately, if the conditions satisfy the judge that you can be out and about and you'll show up to your court date and you'll be around and you're not going to flee the jurisdiction, they let people out all the time. And you see that people post a bond, they're let out, and then they show up in their court in their court proceedings. So that kind of sets the framework there. And so, ultimately where this hearing devolved into, when it was clear that the prosecutor did not have the goods at all on Abrego, they said, one of the reasons why we don't want you to let Abrego out is because he can be deported immediately by ICE to another country other than El Salvador. ICE may deport him. That's why you need to keep him detained. That was like the final argument, to which the federal judge said, why is that? Why do I care about? That's not what I'm here to do. I'm here to do, if ICE does that, ICE does that. And by the way, ICE can do that if they wanted to. Even right now, if ICE wants to deport this guy to another country other than El Salvador, you won't hear Michael Popok and I say they can't do that. I don't like the quality of evidence that he was hit with in 2019 when an immigration judge made the order that said that he can be deported to other countries, but he can. That was the order. That was it. The Trump administration could have done that. They didn't do that. So Popok, let's talk about the detention. Tell us what was interesting to you about that detention hearing. The judge had not ruled yet whether or not Abrego can leave or not, but Abrego's lawyer was putting on a lot of good evidence and basically saying, if he was such a big threat based on a 2022 traffic stop, why didn't you care about him until all of a sudden he became this high-profile figure that Donald Trump had to get? Seems a little suspicious, don't you? Don't you think? Abrego's lawyer, this guy Shabazz, was great, huh? He kept on basically saying to the prosecutor, he was like, "Do you realize that your only witness at tying Abrego as a human trafficker is a snitch who y'all have deported 5 times already? So your main witness is someone who you already deported 5 times." What'd you make of it, Popok?
Yeah, I mean, the judge actually stopped him on that. I'm sorry. What did you just say about the confidential informant? He said he's a 2-time felon and 5-time deported person that's now going to be able to stay in America because he snitched on my client. The judge was like, okay. A couple of unusual things. 6 hours in length is unusual for a detention hearing. The judge, effectively, the magistrate judge, Judge Holmes, basically putting the Department of Justice back on its heels and saying, I'm not even sure you've met the threshold necessary to detain him, let alone what the indictment looks like. and her not ruling at the time of the hearing. That's also unusual. She said it's unusual, but she also said these are unusual circumstances. Some of the facts that I picked up from my own read of what happened in the courtroom is they didn't get around to assigning a agent to do the investigation until the 28th of April. I'll put the timeline together in a minute. And the indictment got spit out less than a month later, 3 weeks later, on May the 21st, while the Trump administration is stonewalling and telling Judge Xinis to pound sand in Maryland, telling the Supreme Court effectively and taunting the Supreme Court, like, we're not going to listen to your 9-0 decision about the return of Abrego Garcia. We're going to do it on our terms with a manufactured lawsuit, a manufactured criminal case in Tennessee that, as you said, based on a traffic stop in 2022, in which they let the guy go. I mean, they played the body cam interaction. Now, there are some things in the facts that were brought out in the hearing that don't exactly track. Like Abrego Garcia said that they had come from St. Louis into Tennessee, but when they did later tracking of the car, he was not in St. Louis, he was in Texas. So whether he lied or didn't lie about that particular issue, whether that makes him a human trafficker, I don't know. But certainly the fact that the entire case was put together in 3 weeks, obviously under tremendous political pressure, that led to the person that was responsible for the case after a 15-year career to throw in the towel and quit. The new person, who's a Democrat, the acting interim U.S. attorney, basically said, I'm the last man standing. That's why I'm here. But I don't think that my federal agent who's about to testify is going to throw away his career and perjure himself. So I believe him. That was the best he could do to present his case against sort of a withering cross-examination by Abrego Garcia's lawyers, with his mother in the room, his wife in the room. And I think they thought they did so well in just cross-examining the government's case in front of her, in front of the judge, the magistrate Judge Holmes, that they didn't even bother putting on the brother. The brother of Abrego Garcia was in the courtroom ready to testify, and they didn't think they needed to put him on related to that. Now, what is a win, WIN, look like for Abrego Garcia? So manage expectations, sort of similar to what you touched on. He's currently in detention while she's making the decision. If she says that you haven't met the threshold to show any of the danger to society, flight risk, all the things that are in the statute for detaining him pretrial based on this indictment with this flimsy evidence, she's not going to let him go, because they're just going to transfer him to an immigration detention center for safekeeping until they do whatever the next thing they're going to do. They still have to deal with a federal judge in Maryland, Judge Xinis, who is not going to let up on the contempt proceeding, because they were in contempt from April the 10th, at least through the return of Abrego Garcia on 2 Fridays ago, where they willfully flouted the orders of Judge Xinis and of the United States Supreme Court, finding them in contempt. I think is the next thing that's going to happen, especially based on some new filings that happened with Judge Xinis that we covered separately. So you got that going on. His civil rights were violated. He was not given due process before he was sent to El Salvador. And the fact that he's now been returned doesn't solve that problem necessarily. Could they, as you said, deport him under other circumstances, as long as it doesn't violate that law? I still think there needs to be due process related to it. I still don't think Xinis is going to give up on it. And we'll have to see how these next steps that are uncharted play out. But I think that a win is going to be if we're able to announce on Legal AF and on the Midas Touch Network that he's not going to be detained for the criminal case, and he's now been transferred over to federal immigration detention, wherever that may be. At least he's on this side of the Atlantic, or on American soil, where federal judges and habeas corpus petitions, and it looks like very competent lawyers that we know, of course, can assist him. So that's what I think plays out. But the fact that it went 6 hours, the judge was skeptical during most of it. You had a kind of a half-hearted support for the case by the acting interim U.S. attorney. You had the one Homeland Security agent testifying about a 3-week case that he trumped up. and all the other facts that we've talked about all came out at the same time. But if anybody thinks he's going home to Maryland to be with his wife and his two children who are all U.S. citizens, that's not happening.
Or at least it's not happening anytime soon.
Yeah.
And from the outset, it's never that I've I've been rooting for Abrego Garcia as a human being. I don't know enough about the guy to vouch for Abrego. From what I've heard from people who work with him, seems like a hardworking guy in Maryland. The people who he worked with at his union seem to like him. But look, if the guy committed crimes in the United States and he receives due process and goes in front of a jury, and a jury ultimately convicts him of crimes, and crimes are presented through the normal course. Look, my position has always been that that's the system that we have, and you and I have always made it very clear. If there are migrants who are involved in criminal conduct, of course they should either be deported or they should be fully prosecuted. That's it. That's not what the Trump regime is doing, though. They're targeting factories, and as you mentioned at the outset, Home Depot parking lots and restaurants, and they're going into communities that are hardworking migrant communities, ripping families apart, and creating, torturing these hardworking communities with people who are paying their taxes, who are very important to the United States of America, and who in those communities who are citizens appreciate these people who are in the communities. My belief is always that there needs to be, for hardworking migrants, we need an overall overhaul of our immigration system. There needs to be more programs like the Dreamers Act and have a pathway to citizenship. People who are here undocumented, but who are working hard and paying their taxes and contributing and doing all of those types of things, they shouldn't have to fear that they need to kind of live, their lives and in hiding, outside of their communities or the block that they live on. So I'm for comprehensive immigration reform. I'm for strong borders. I'm not for violations of due process. And Popok, I believe, even though I disagree with how the immigration judge in 2019 used an officer's double hearsay statement of an officer who was disgraced for, I think, being taking money from, giving secrets to prostitutes and there's a whole thing about who the cop even was who was involved in that 2019. It seemed like a shady, dirty cop to begin with who was involved in the 2019. But the order said you can deport this guy to any other country. He got the process before an immigration judge. I thought it was a bad process, but he got the process. And they could have deported him to any other country other than the order just says, except El Salvador, you can't do it.
Welcome back. Ben Meiselas and me put that podcast together 5 years ago. It's hard to believe, but we still feel like we're brand new because of you. Maybe you wandered your way in here today. Maybe the algorithm sent you here. Maybe you've been here since day one or someplace in the middle. Regardless, we're inviting you now to join us on Legal AF, the podcast. We do it every week, Wednesdays and Saturdays at 8 p.m. You like to watch your podcast? We got a place for it. YouTube. Join us on YouTube, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, Wednesdays and Saturdays. You like to listen to your audio podcast? Come over to any podcast platform. Download Legal AF. We could use the audio downloads, to be frank. Do both. That helps the cause as well. And then come over to Legal AF, the YouTube channel, Legal AF MTN for Legal AF Midas Touch Network over on YouTube, where we're doing videos about every hour at that same intersection of law and politics. So until my next report, I'm Michael Popok. I'm Michael Popok, and I got some big news for our audience. Most of you know me as the co-founder of Midas Touch's Legal AF and the Legal AF YouTube channel, or as a 35-year national trial lawyer. Now, building on what we started together on Legal AF, I've launched a new law firm, the Popok Firm, dedicated to obtaining justice through compassionate and zealous legal representation. At the Popok Firm, we are focused on obtaining justice for those who have been injured or damaged by a life-altering event, by securing the highest dollar recoveries. I've been tirelessly fighting for justice for the last 35 years, so my own law firm organically building on my Legal AF work just feels right. And I've handpicked a team of top-tier trial fighters and settlement experts throughout all 50 states known as big auto injury attorneys who have the know-how to beat heartless insurance companies, corporations, government entities, and their attorneys. Big Auto's attorneys working with my firm are rock stars in their respective states and collectively responsible for billions of dollars in recoveries. So if you or a loved one have been on the wrong side of a catastrophic auto, motor vehicle, rideshare, or truck accident, suffered a personal injury, or been the victim of medical malpractice, employment harassment or discrimination, or suffered a violation of your civil and constitutional rights, then contact the Popok firm today at 1-877-POPOK-AF or by visiting my website at www.thepopokfirm.com and fill out a free case evaluation form. And if we determine that you have a case and you sign with us, we don't get paid unless you do. The Popok firm, fighting for your justice every step of the way.